gorgeous Zanele in the corner there. For all your auction finance needs, please guys give her a call. She is there in her little office there on view days and the day of auctions. Or you can pick up one of the pamphlets, you can give her a shout, and you can get pre-approval prior to the auction, which makes it a lot easier for you, and you can buy with confidence that your finance is approved. Today we are selling exclusively West Bank vehicles. In such saying, there is a risk when buying on auction. Just because we say it is a runner does not mean that you are going to get a CRR for it. There is still work that needs to be done. All vehicles will hold a 6% buyer's premium, a 2,600 Rand documentation fee, and VAT on the whole lot. Once you have bidded on the vehicles, they'll be sold subject to vetting, which means after the auction you will be vetted, and once that is cleared, you will receive your invoice. Once you have received your invoice, you've got 48 hours in which to pay. Guys, a reminder, when you are bidding on the vehicles, you have acknowledged that you know more about the vehicles than what we do. We are selling as is, foots, no duty to repair. We do not guarantee their mileages. Is there any further questions to the floor? No. We all good to go? Nirvana? Jay, have you done a test? Sounds fun. Let's get going. Right, lot number 3 is a 2023. It's a Toyota LPT. It's a 1518. It's an 8-tonner. It's a drop side, and we have got a current bid of 102,000 Rand. Let's go up in 2.5s. No, we can go up in 5s, that's fine. At 107, looking for 112. At 107,000 Rand, looking for 112, 117 we have. At 107, looking for 112. At 107,000 Rand, looking for 112. At 107,000 Rand, no more. Is there any further advance? Drop it to 2.5. Drop it to 2.5. At 112, we're looking for 114.5. At 112, we're looking for 114.5. Is there no further advance? At 112, 114.5, 114.5, looking for 117. At 114.5, we're looking for 117. And we are selling, guys, we're selling. At 114.5, 117.5, looking for 119. At 117, we'll be looking at 119.5, we're looking for 122. At 119.5, we're looking for 122. At 100.5 for the first. Drop it a 1, and let's go. Drop it a 1. At 109.5, let's go 120.5. At 119.5, looking for 120.5 for the first. Second, third and final call. No more. Sold at 119,500 to buy a 1069. Ladies and gentlemen, that's how it works. Let's go. Lot number 4. Lot number 4. Just a reminder, all these vehicles are sold subject to vetting. This vehicle is lot number 4, will be sold subject to vetting as well as subject to confirmation. It is a West Bank fleet vehicle. We're sitting at 32,000 Rand, looking for 33. At 33, I'm looking for 34. At 33,000, I've got 34. I have 34. At 34,000, looking for 35. At 35,000, looking for 36. At 35,000, looking for 36. Is it 36 we have? At 36,000, looking for 37. At 37, looking for 38. At 37,000, looking for 38. At 38, looking for 39. At 38,000, looking for 39. At 39, looking for 40. At 39,000, looking for 40. Is there no further advance? At 40,000 I have. At 40,000 I'm looking for 41. At 40,000, 41 I'm looking for 42. At 41,000 I'm looking for 42. At 42 I'm looking for 43. At 43 I'm looking for 44. At 44 I'm looking for 46. At 46 I need. At 46,000 Rand. No more. At 45,000 looking for 46. Going for the first. At 46, go up in 2s, go up in 2s. At 46,000, looking for 48. At 46,000, looking for 48. Is there no further advance? At 46, at 48, at 48, I'm looking for 50 round. At 48,000 Rand, I'm looking for 50 round. At 50, at 50,000, looking for 52. At 50,000, I'm looking for 52. No more. Drop it by 1 and let's go. At 52, at 52,000, looking for 53. At 52,000, looking for 53. Look 53, looking for 54. At 53,000, 54. At 54,000, looking for 55. At 55, looking for 56. Go up and choose again. Competitive bidding. At 56,000, looking for 58. At 56,000, looking for 58. No more. Going for the first. At 58. At 58,000, looking for 60 round. At 58,000, looking for 60 round. 60. At 60,000, looking for 62. At 62, looking for 64. At 62,000, looking for 64. No more at 62. Going for the first. 64. At 64,000, looking for 66. At 66, looking for 68. Is there no further advance? At 66 for the first. 68. At 68,000 rand for the first. At 70,000 rand for the first. At 70,000 rand for the second. 72. At 72,000 for the first. At 74 for the first. At 74 for the second. At 76. At 76,000, looking for 78. At 78, looking for 80 round. At 78 for the first. At 78 for the second. At 78 for the third and final call. No more. Sold at 78,000 rand to buy a 1, 2, 4, 5. Lot number 5 is a 2022. It's a Tata. It's a 813, and we are sitting at a bid of 101 at 103, at 103 and a half. At 103 and a half, I'm looking for 106. At 103 and a half, I'm looking for 106. Go up in fives. Go up in fives. At 108 and a half. At 108 and a half, I'm looking for 113 and a half. At 113 and a half, I'm looking for 118 and a half. At 118 and a half, looking for 123 and a half. At 123 and a half. At 123 and a half, and I'm nearly ready to sell. At 128 and a half. At 128, at 123, at 138 and a half. And we are selling at 138 and a half. At 138 and a half, looking for 143 and a half. At 138 and a half, selling at 143 and a half. At 148 and a half, looking for 153 and a half. At 153 and a half, looking for 158 and a half. At 158 and a half, looking for 163 and a half. Drop it at twos, drop it at twos. At 158 and a half, looking for 160 and a half. At 158 and a half, looking for 160 and a half. Drop it at 1 and let's go. At 158 and a half, looking for 159 for the first, for the second, for the third and final call. No more. At 159 and a half. At 159 and a half, 160 and a half. At 160 and a half, looking for 161 and a half. At 160 and a half for the first. At 160 and a half for the second. At 160 and a half for the third and final call. No more. Sold at 160 and a half. Come on, guys. Unfortunately, I've said sold 160,500 to buy a 1074. Can't open it. Come, guys. There was a customer there. Can't go back. I said sold. Yeah. Lot number 6. Lot number 6 is a 2023. It's a FAW 8 140. We are sitting at 156,000 rand. We're going up in fives. At 156,000, I'm looking for 161. At 156, 161, I'm looking for 166. At 161, I'm looking for 166. Is there no further advance at 166? At 166,000, I'm 171. At 171,000 rand, I'm looking for 176. At 171,000, I'm looking for 176. And we are selling, guys, at 171,000. Drop it at twos, drop it at twos. At 176. At 176, we're looking for 178. At 176,000, I'm looking for 178. 178, I'm looking for 180 round. At 178, I'm looking for 180 round. At 180,000, I'm looking for 182. At 182, I'm looking for 184. At 182, I'm looking for 184. At 184. At 184, I'm like 186. At 186, I'm 188. At 188, I'm looking for 190 round. At 190, 192. At 192, I'm looking for 194. At 194, I'm looking for 196. At 196, I'm looking for 198. At 198, I'm looking for 200 round. At 200 round, I need 200 round. At 198, I'm looking at 198, 200. At 200,000 rand, and I'm still selling. At 200,000 rand for the first. At 200,000 for the second. At 200,000 for the third and final call. 202. at 202 for the first, at 202 for the second, 202, 204. At 204 for the first, at 204 for the second, at 204 for the third and final call. No more. 206. At 206 we got. At 206 for the first, at 208. At 208 for the first, for the second, 210. At 210,000 rand I have. At 210 for the first, second, third and final call. No more. 212. At 212 for the first, 212 for the second, and 212 for the third and final call. No more. Sold at 212,000 rand to buy a 1117. Lot number 7 is a 2022. It's an Isuzu PR 400. And we're sitting with an opening bid of, opening bid of 171. At 171, we're looking at 176. At 176, I'm looking for 181. At 181,000, I'm looking for 186. At 181, I'm looking for 186. At 181,000 rand, I'm looking for 186. At 186, I'm looking for 191. At 191, I'm looking for 196. At 191, I'm looking for 196. At 191, I'm looking for 196. Is it no further advance at 191,000? My bid at 196. At 196 at 201. At 201,000 rand, I'm looking at 206. At 201,000 rand, I'm going to sell. At 206, at 206, at 211, at 211, I'm looking for 216. At 216, I'm looking for 221. At 216, I'm looking for 221. At 221, I'm looking for 226. At 226, I'm looking for 231. At 226, I'm looking for 231. Is there no further advance at 231? I'm looking for 236. At 236, I'm looking for 241. At 236, I'm looking for 241. 241. At 241, I'm looking for 246. At 241, I'm looking for 246. Drop it at 2.5. Drop it at 2.5. At 241, I'm looking for 243.5. At 241, I'm looking for 243.5. Is there no further advance at 241,000? Drop it at 1 and let's go. At 241 for the first. At 241 for the second. At 241 for the third and final call. No more. Sold at 241,000 to buy a 1074. Lot number 8 is a 2023. It's a Nissan CW 26460, and we have a current bid of 500 rand. Go up in tens. At 500,000, I'm looking for 510. I'm looking for 515. At 505, I'm looking for 515. There's no further advance at 505. At 505, I'm looking for 515. It's a 2023 Nissan UD with 205,000 Ks. Is there no further advance? At 505, looking for 510. Looking at 510 with a trade over $1 million rand. Drop it at 5. Drop it at 5. At 505, I'm looking for 510. At 510, I'm looking for 515. At 510, I'm looking for 515. Is there no further at 515 I have? At 515 online. At 520, I've got. At 520,000, I'm looking for 525. At 525, I'm looking at 525. Is there no further 525? I'm looking for 530 round. I have. At 530, I'm looking for 535. At 535, I'm looking for 540. I have. At 540,000 rand, looking for 545. At 545, looking for 550 round. At 550,000, I'm looking for 550. Is there no further advance at 545? One more, give it a bash. At 550. At 550, got 555. I have. At 555, looking for 560. Is there no further advance at 555,000 rand for the first? At 555,000 rand for the second. At 560. Well, okay, 565. 570, he says. 570. At 570, we're going to go up in 5. At 570,
usually the trucks don't really get sold.
575. At 575, 580, 580 I have. At 580,000 rand, I'm looking for 585. At 580,000 rand for the first. At 580,000 rand for the second. At 585, at 590. At 590,000 rand I had. At 590,000 rand, I'm looking for 592 and a half, I'll take. At 592 and a half, I'll take. At 592 and a half, I have. At 592 and a half, I'll take. At 592, looking for 595. At 592 and a half thousand, looking for 595.
Sell.
At 595 and 597 and a half. Thank you for being quicker this time. At 597 and a half, I have. At 597 and a half, looking for 600 round. At 597 and a half, no more. 600. At 600,000 rand, we're looking for 602 and a half. Don't shake your head at me. Don't shake your head at me. At 600,000 rand, we're a little bit low. Andrew K, what are we doing? What are we doing? We are selling. We are selling at 600,000 rand. Can I drop it to 1? Can I drop it to 1? Yes or no on the truck? Can we get 601? Can we get 601? At 600,000 rand for the first. At 600,000 for the second. At 600,000 for the third and final call. No more. I don't believe it. Sold at 600,000 rand to buy a 1069. Lot number 9, lot number 9 at 2022. It's a Power Star FT8 and we are sitting at 83,000 rand. Let's go up in twos. At 83,000, looking for 85. At 83,000 rand, I'm looking for 85. At 83,000 rand, I'm looking for 85. At 85,000 rand, looking for 87 and a half. At 85, I'm looking for 87 and a half. At 85,000. Guys, we are selling it at 85,000 rand for the first. Third to the floor. At 87 and a half. At 87 and a half. Thank you very much for spotting that. At 87 and a half, I'm looking for 90 round. At 87 and a half, I'm looking for 90 round. At 87 and a half, I'm looking for 90 and 90,000 rand. You want to go 92 and a half. At 92 and a half, I have. At 92 and a half, I have. At 92 and a half, I'm looking for 95. At 92 and a half, I'm looking for 95. Is there no further advance at 92 and a half? I'm dwelling because it is a little bit low. It is a little bit low. And I'm selling at 92 and a half for the first. Second. Third and final call, no more. Sold at 92,500 to buy a number 741.